Hey guys, in today's video I'm going to show you all how I made a working tradable version of Pokemon Yellow for the Super Nintendo. This project was really fun to do, but it was a little time consuming, so I hope you guys find this video entertaining. But anyways, let's just get started. Okay, so to start things off, you'll need to get yourself a Super Game Boy. Now you might notice that I have all Famicom versions here, and that's really only for one reason. Price. You can find these ones pretty cheap most of the time, but you may notice some cosmetic flaws like the case turning yellow, or maybe there's some writing on them. Other than that though, if you'd like to use the North American version of the Super Game Boy, you can. The boards are pretty much identical. I'd also like to mention ahead of time that this process is completely reversible should you ever wish to go back to using just the Super Game Boy. Next up would obviously be a Pokemon game, but I'm not going to use an official cartridge for this for one reason. Can you guess it? Price, yet again. And I also don't have the heart to potentially ruin a game that can cost $50 or more. So I went to the website Inside Gadgets and I purchased some programmable Game Boy boards for about half the cost. So I can just write the ROMs for my physical copies to those. I even managed to color scheme the boards to match Pokemon Yellow, Red, and Blue. Although you'll probably never see them since it'll be on the inside of the cartridge. Moving on now, let's start disassembling the Super Game Boy cartridge. All we have to do is just unscrew the 4 screws that are on the front of the cartridge using a 3.8mm Gambit screwdriver, or sometimes I just call it a Nintendo screwdriver. After the front is removed, we have to remove the screws on the 32-pin connector which holds the board to the case. This one is a Phillips head, so no biggie. After that's done, now we can finally start with some soldering. The 32-pin connector that we were just talking about, we gotta take it out. So start by applying some flux, which is going to be your best friend when doing this. And then start the tedious task of desoldering each pin, which is pretty boring, so I'll just skip ahead. And when we're all done, it should look like this. Now, all we have to do is just gently, and I mean gently, rock the connector back and forth until it comes out. You don't want to break any of the pins, so just be careful when you're doing this. And here we go. Now that that's out, we can move on to the next step, which will be soldering in a clock fix chip to the board. The reason this is needed is because the Super Game Boy runs about 2.5% faster than an original Game Boy, which made this illegal to use for speedruns for that obvious reason. This is really only noticeable in the audio playback, so let me give you an example and see if you can tell the difference. This is Pokemon Silver running on the Super Game Boy. This is Pokemon Silver running with the corrected clock speed. Could you tell which one's which? Let's see if you can tell if I play them both at the same time. Alright, I think it was pretty noticeable which one was faster that time. And that's exactly what we're going to fix with the Super Game Boy Clock Mod V3 that I bought from the website Qwertymoto. I'll leave a link in the description for everything that I'm mentioning in this video today. But not only does this fix the clock speed, but it's also what's going to make trading possible by fixing the desync issue. But if you don't care about trading and you don't care about the clock speed, you can actually just skip doing this part. Continuing on now though, we have to start removing 3 components from the Super Game Boy board, which is R1, R7, and C15. I'll have future Jeremy leave a diagram so there's no confusion. These are pretty simple to remove, just add a little bit of flux and then press the soldering iron along the edges of the component and it should almost slide right out. Once all 3 have been removed, let's head back over to R1 and use the desoldering braid to clean that pad up since this is where the clock fix chip is going to be going. The chip is pretty easy to install since there's only 4 points we need to touch. You just need to have it set up like I do, with the 2 middle connections lined up with the R1 spot. And on the very right, that spot will be connected to only the left side of C5. Now, once you have this all lined up right, you can start passing the iron over it, and again, it's pretty easy to install. As long as you apply some flux, you should be able to easily tack the board in place. Once that's done, things can finally start getting interesting. I purchased a Game Boy to Super Game Boy flex cable from Mordoff Games, who seems to be the only one selling these. What this does is basically bypasses the need for the 32-pin connector we removed earlier. All we have to do is attach one end to the Super Game Boy and the other end to the Game Boy game. So to start off, make sure you have the game already written to the board. I don't want to make this video too long, so I'm not going to cover how the games are added onto the boards too much, especially since Inside Gadgets has their own tutorials for that on their site. But if you're interested in another video of me covering that, just let me know in the comments. So what I'm doing now is adding some flux to these pads so it'll be easier for me to start tinning them. I recommend using a chisel tip on your iron. It really will make things go a little more smoothly. So just add some solder to your iron and start applying it to all 32 pads. It's important to note though that we are just tinning these. These should be flat and smooth when it's finished. If yours isn't, then you can take the desoldering braid to those spots and just take off the appropriate amount. And this is what it should look like when you're finished. Now we can connect the first half of the flex cable. Going from left to right, you can see the number 1 and 32. This needs to be connected just like I'm showing you here, with those numbers facing you. After that, we just need to attach it together. Something that might help you is adding a piece of electrical tape just to hold everything in place while you get the first couple of pads tacked in. We're doing this just like the rest, adding a little bit of flux and then tracing down the pads. Just make sure you don't bridge any connections. Skipping ahead though, this is what it should ultimately look like when it's done. It's worth mentioning as well that I have been cleaning these spots up with rubbing alcohol that have any flux residue left over on it as I go. But now we can start on the other end and attach it to the Super Game Boy. This can only really be placed in one way, so just make sure everything lines up properly and we can start tacking these in. You can use the tape method I just told you about to make things a little easier, and then just go down the line until you get all 32 pads, but I'll skip ahead to the end result for this one as well. So it came out pretty good. Just make sure none of the connections are bridging and clean up the areas with some alcohol. I hope you guys don't mind all the soldering that's going on in this video because we still have a little more to do. We can finally start working on the trading function now. I'm using this cool board that was designed by Thursday Customs, which used to be part of a kit on their site, but unfortunately is now no longer sold. Luckily, they provided the designs for the board so you can get them made for yourself over at Oshpark. The only downside now is you have to assemble it yourself, which includes soldering some resistors and a diode, which again, I'll leave links to down below. So now I'm going to start applying some solder to the pads that I need. The 2 on the far right are the resistors. The 5 in the bottom are the wires connecting to the Super Game Boy. Slightly to the left of that will be another resistor. And then finally, all the way to the left will be the diode. So we'll start off by putting in the resistors. These are really tiny, so it helps if you have a pair of tweezers on hand. And we're just going to start placing these on the pads and then tack them in with the iron. Sorry if the camera quality isn't the best here. I don't really have a lens that has a good quality zooming for going in this far, but these are simple. Just tack them in one end at a time and apply some pressure to the resistor with the tweezers to keep them in place while it cools. I'm just going to skip ahead to where all 3 are done. Okay, you can see here I have all 3 in. Now I can attach the diode as well, which we'll have to trim to size. Just make sure when you put it in, the diode is facing the correct way up. I'll skip ahead to where mine is in place so we can save some time. So I have mine placed in like this, which you'll see why later, but you can place this in any way you want. Now we can actually add in the actual TradeLink port. I'm using a Game Boy Advance port, which you can use either or. The Game Boy Advance ports though are easier and cheaper to find. I bought a pack of these on eBay for like less than $10. It fits in just like I'm showing you here, and all we have to do is just solder them in on the other side of the board. I actually got lucky and found it easy to hold this on my pair of tweezers while I solder them in place. It doesn't have to be really pretty, just make sure all the pins are covered. So now that we're all done setting this up, we can finally attach it to the Super Game Boy. You're going to need some 30-AUG wire. I'll be separating mine by color and cutting off about 6 inches of each. You don't have to match the color if you don't want to. Then we're going to strip both ends of every wire, and then we're going to tin the wires. Just make sure you twist up the ends real tight before tinning it. Now that the prep work is done, we can work on probably the hardest part of the whole project, soldering onto the pins on the CPU. And I'll try to get as good of a shot as me doing this as I can, but worst case, I'll have future Jeremy leave something up for you to see as we go. But we want to look at the bottom left of the CPU where the number 65 is. The pin closest to the left is pin number 65. We want to solder our wires onto pins 68, 69, and 70. Let's start by putting the 3 CPU wires we're going to use through the holes on the board. After that, I'll start with pin 68 and tack the green wire into place. Then we'll do the same thing for pin 69 using the blue wire. And then for pin 70 using the yellow wire. Next up, we have 2 more wires to do, and they're going to be on the other side of the board. But before we do that, we can pull whatever remaining slack we had from the first 3 wires through the front of the board. That way we can clean up the back of the board a little bit. So the next 2 wires we're going to be soldering are the power and the ground wire, with ground being the lower option. Once again, a little bit of flux, tin the pads, tack the ground wire in, and then tack the power wire in. Now we just have to connect the other ends of those wires onto the SGB link board. Looking at the board how I have it here, we're going to solder in the following wires in order. The ground wire on the far right, pin 68 to SC, pin 69 to SI, pin 70 to SO, and the power wire to VCC. And we are finally done with the soldering iron. Now we can start talking about the cool stuff, like the cases. Since I'm adding a trading function, I'm definitely making more than 1 cartridge, and because of that, I ended up shopping around at a bunch of different places for the cases, like eBay, AliExpress, Mordoff Games, and a couple of other places, just looking for colors that I wanted to check out. So I'll be displaying the whole set for you guys shortly, but let's just start off with yellow. There were weirdly different shades of yellow options when I was picking cartridges, but I think this one is the overall color I was looking for. The unfortunate thing is that we're going to have to trim this case. Reason being, we're using the Famicom Super Game Boy board and putting it into a North American case, so it's not going to fit very well. I've seen people trim the case with tin snips and X-Acto knives, but I'll be doing this with a Dremel because it's a bit more precise. Except, this is my first time using a Dremel, and I'm not that precise, so don't mind me. So the first thing we're going to cut off is the bottom lip here of the space where the connections would normally slide through. We're just going to trim this area so the whole thing is flat. If it's not pretty, you can always go over it later with a file. The next spot will be this little corner here that I'm pointing at. It's a little bit too high and makes the board not sit flush, so that's leaving too. Same goes for this piece right next to it. This one we don't want to cut off though, we just want to slightly file it down just to make it a little bit shorter. Now we're going to trim off this stub in the middle of the case. And lastly, we just have to slightly nick the corner of this piece in the top right so the corner of the board can sit nice. All I'm going to do is run the Dremel along the higher part just to trim it down a smidge. And now you can see the board fits nice and neat. All we have to do next is just cut out the trade port. So with the trade port, just line it up where you want to put it and then mark it with a pencil. It's really that easy. When this was originally sold as a kit, it came included with some pieces to screw the SGB link into the case. I couldn't find what size those were used, so I defaulted to just using a hot glue gun, which you'll see later. Feel free to try screwing it in, but I think I'll like it better without the screws attached to a weird spot on the case. But anyways, after the spots have been marked, just cut it out with a Dremel. This I think is going to fit fine, but again, I'm not that great with a Dremel, so I know this isn't going to be perfect. I'm just going to do the exact same thing for the top half of the case, so let me just skip ahead to that. So this is roughly how the port will look. I still have to go over the whole thing with a file and clean up the areas that are messy, but I'll skip that part for you guys. So now with the SGB link fitted in place, I'm just going to apply some hot glue around the edges of the board. If I have any issues with this in the future, I'll just switch to the screws. So now fitting the actual board into place, I'm also going to apply a small amount of glue in the corners, just to make sure it always sits firm in there. But you probably don't need to do this part. Just so you guys know, since I didn't take a clip of this part, the Game Boy game that's attached to the flex cable is actually tucked behind the Super Game Boy before we, sat it into place and glued in the corners. Now, on to all the extra wires hanging around. A lot of people like to twist these up so it's a little bit more clean inside of the case. I didn't do this though, since I glued the board, in case I ever need to change out a wire or just if something goes wrong. All I'm gonna do is just pinch them together and then put them underneath the flex cable just like this. And now all we have to do is just snap the case together. But what's a case without a nice label? So I bought these labels from onyxcomics.com, which I had a great experience with. The seller was really nice and was kind of knowledgeable with what I was doing, and that was tons of help. So thanks again, Onyx, for helping me out. All right, now let's take a look at all these cartridges put together, starting with yellow. So with this one, I think it turned out really well. I know I didn't show the other cases that I had with the other shades of yellow, but I think this one was the right option. The trade port isn't really that clean, but this was actually the first cartridge that I made, and I feel like I got better at cutting out the ports as I made the rest. But let's move on. So the next thing I did was Pokemon Blue. With this, I wanted to use a translucent cartridge and see how it turned out, similar to what I did with my N64 Pokemon videos. What do you guys think? Should I have gone with a solid color? One other thing I did with this cartridge was that I added a ROM hack to it. I really didn't want to change the game much, but I did want it to be slightly different since I'm playing it on a different system. I went with Pokemon Blue Gender Hack, which allows you to just add a gender option at the start of the game, but leaves the base game relatively untouched. So this is a pretty cool option if you want to try something like this with the other cartridges as well. Now, case-wise, because I did this with Blue, I did the exact same thing with Pokemon Red, which I also think looks pretty rad. And now I want to talk about Pokemon Gold for a second. Just like in my Pokemon N64 videos, I wanted to have a cartridge match as close to the Game Boy cartridge as I could, meaning the kind of gold sparkle that was on the original cartridge. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anyone selling that kind of empty cartridge on its own, but I did find one of these 125-in-1 cartridges that had exactly what I was looking for. So once again, I removed the label ever so gently, and then proceeded to yeet the board. Now we just have to apply my label, and we can have a nice looking Pokemon Gold cartridge. And you know what? I'm pretty proud that I was able to get that sparkle. Now, unfortunately though, I couldn't do the same thing with silver. I couldn't find anything with that sort of sparkle in a gray color. If you know any place that sells one like that, let me know in the comments. But I only had two options, basic gray, or I can go with like a chrome finish. So to not be basic, I went with chrome. I had mixed reviews on this when I posted it in the Discord, so let me know what you think. Now, we can't have all these cartridges without going the extra mile and having some box art. So you know I had that done as well. I actually bought these over on Etsy from the seller Hack to the Future. He has a lot of neat box art for all sorts of things, including ROM hacks, so definitely check out his store. So I think all that's left for me to do is just show you all some gameplay of the trading working. So let's head over to that and I'll start wrapping things up. Okay, so I have Pokemon Gold here on the left and Pokemon Silver on the right. And I'm gonna try trading Gold's Cyndaquil for Silver's Weedle, which is a steal, by the way. But let's see how it plays out. And you can see here the trade went through and we got Cyndaquil over here on the silver version. It's a shame I couldn't do Pokemon Crystal because Crystal didn't work on the Super Game Boy, unfortunately. But one last thing I will show you guys before I go is that the Super Game Boy actually had a menu section that you could bring up by tapping both shoulder buttons at the same time. This did a couple of different things like being able to change the color palette of the game, or even changing the borders around to give you something fresh to look at. But I think that's just about it from me, guys. So for those of you that stuck it out with me into the end, I appreciate you all, and I will see you guys in the next video. Adios.